name actually is Sergeant Major Matthew Krenz with the National Guard Bureau Office of Legislative Affairs. I'm an Arkansas National Guardsman. The reason I put that out, again, I work for the National Guard Bureau. I'm on Title 10 orders, but I'm an Arkansas National Guardsman. That's where I come from. That's where I'm always going to go ahead and belong to. So that's a very important thing for us to be able to understand on that Title 10 perspective, is that we each belong to a state. Who? All right, I'm going to give a brief update as far as the legislative affairs and perspective from my foxhole up in Washington, D.C. So I've been in this position for roughly about 7 months. During that 7 months, we've had quite a bit of information flow with Capitol Hill, quite a bit going on. We had our former chief, General Grass, go ahead and retire, and we have our brand new chief, General Lengel, that's basically assumed control of the National Guard Bureau. So I'm going to go ahead and talk with you a little bit about his perspective as far as objectives as we go ahead and engage with Congress. I'm also going to let you know the kind of hot rocks or different things that we have going on in the Hill right now. Three main objectives that General Lengel is taking a look at. First and foremost, preserve the operational force. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come way too far over the course of the last 15 years to go back to the way things were before as far as being a strategic reserve. As far as from the vision of General Lengel and the directors, Lieutenant General Kadavy and Lieutenant General Rice, we want to ensure that the National Guard, both Army and Air, remain an operational reserve force, prepared to go ahead and support the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, Department of the Army, when they need our assistance as far as deployments overseas, as well as being able to focus on being a steady operational force here at the home. Our second priority, as far as we take a look at, is taking care of soldiers and taking care of their families. We've seen a lot of different legislation that's being pushed right now with the National Defense Authorization Act and different things associated with benefits, not only for families, but for that service member. We are taking a very hard line to ensure that there's going to be equal benefits associated with our active duty counterparts and National Guard soldiers and airmen as far as benefits when it comes to education, benefits when it comes to things as far as a reduction of retirement benefits from age 60, depending on the number of deployments that the individual has, down to age 59, 58, depending on how much qualifying time they have for that. The last piece we take a look at is focus on equipment modernization and recapitalization. So what does that mean? Maintaining the operational reserve means we need to have the same type of equipment, same type of training as our active duty counterparts. And the truth of the matter is fighting with the Army and the Air Force in order to make sure that happens sometimes can be very difficult. We definitely want to be one force, one Air Force, and one Army. But many times we need to go ahead and talk with our congressional delegations and let them notice how important that is for the National Guard to be ready, modernized, have the right equipment not only for the warfight overseas, to make sure that we have the equipment and things needed to go ahead and defend the home front. These are some of the hot rocks that we're taking a look at right now. So we are still actively working issues from the FY16 National Defense Authorization Act. Title 32, Title 5 conversion. I'm sure a large number of you are very aware of what's going on with this issue and how it's going to affect the National Guard, both Army and Air. As things stand right now, this conversion of the 20% initially from the Title 32 dual status technicians to Title 5 will start 1 January of 2017. We are actively working right now to try to go ahead and have that at least pushed off. So instead of implementing or starting this in 1 January, we're trying to get it pushed to 1 October of 2017. 9 months, not a lot of time, but that gives us a lot more time to be able to dive into the situation and come up with the right solution for that problem. So that is something that we are working on very, very closely in order to make sure that that transition is going to be as seamless as possible and make sure that it does what it needs to support the National Guard, both Army and the Air. Moving on to the FY17 NDAA. This year has been a very unique year when it comes to legislation. for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, this is an election year, but we're seeing quite a bit of difference between the House and the Senate's version of the National Defense Authorization Act for this year. So what does this mean? Well, at this point in time, both the House and the Senate have passed their versions of the National Defense Authorization Act for FY17. But because of those differences, when the Senate and the House come back into session, starting September 6th, they have a lot of work to do in order to try to conference that bill to come up with a single piece of legislation that is going to be fair to both sides, the House and the Senate. I can tell you right now there's some pretty big, significant differences when it comes to the end strength of the Army National Guard. There's some pretty big, significant differences when it comes to some general officer and three-star level cuts that part of Congress is looking to go ahead and put across the Department of Defense. So as we get ready to go into September, this is going to be a very important piece for the National Guard as far as how this National Defense Authorization Act goes through. Through recess, we have adamantly been working with the offices on both the Armed Services Committee for the House and the Senate to try to let them know the impacts that the possible legislation is going to have on the National Guard as a force when it talks about end strength and our general officer reductions. The most important thing that you need to understand when we take a look at end strength for the Army National Guard from the perspective of Chief National Guard Bureau and the directors. On the Army side, whether we stay at 350 or whether we go with the Senate's version down to 335, the most important piece that we take a look at is that we have the funding appropriated that supports the force that we have. Currently, we are trending down as the Army has looked to downsize the force. We are on our path right now at end strength to reach 342 this year and then currently go down to 335. So we are on a downward slope to go ahead and, through the financial piece, support a force at 335. We have no problem with maintaining a force of 350,000 in the Army. But in order to maintain that force, we need to have the resources and the funding allocated to support a force at 350. Without that, that goes ahead and defeats the purpose when we take a look at trying to be in an operational reserve. We need to have the funding, we need to have the resources and training to support a force of 350,000 soldiers. Next piece we take a look at is a National Commission for the Future of the Army. Over the course of about the last year and a half, the National Commission of the Future of the Army, or NACFA, has went through and made multiple recommendations to the Department of the Army as far as things that need to happen within all three components of the Army. Active component, reserve component, Army National Guard. Two big pieces that came out of the NACFA on the recruiting piece were, number one, the consolidation of all marketing materials in the Army's pocketbook, so to speak. The big concern the National Guard has for that we're working on is that as a National Guard member, we are marketing specifically in our local communities, in our states, in our territories, in the District of Columbia. So having a national campaign that markets for the Army is great, but we need to make sure that we have that reach-down effect to be able to get down into the local areas within each state, territory, and the district to make sure that we can attract those young men and women to be able to serve in the National Guard. Next piece we take a look at as far as a contentious piece up on Capitol Hill is what they call ARI, or the Aviation Restructure Initiative. This is something that happened on the Army side where they tried to go ahead and withdraw the Apache battalions from the Army National Guard and replace it with support helicopters. Through the work of the states, the adjutant generals and associations, they're able to go ahead and let Congress know we don't want that. We want the National Guard to be able to maintain its Apache battalions within the National Guard. As a result, Congress has said, okay, we'll go ahead and do that. We will allow the National Guard to go ahead and maintain those 4 Apache battalions in the states. The big piece right now is taking a look at where those Apache battalions are going to go. Part of this NACFA recommendations came to look at possibly consolidating these battalions into very specific locations so they'd be much easier to be able to be prepared for deployment. Moving on, We talked about benefits a little bit earlier. 12304 Bravo orders. The National Guard is going to start seeing issues when it comes to deployments of their National Guard soldiers to missions such as Sinai, our AFRICOM missions down to Djibouti, based on the authorization that is used to deploy those National Guard soldiers. During the conflict, during the height of Afghanistan and Iraq, thank you. In order to support our combatant commanders, this authorization, 12304 Bravo, was created to quickly allow National Guard soldiers to be able to mobilize and deploy overseas. It wasn't until after the fact that was realized, at least from the National Guard Bureau perspective, that this authorization did not afford the same benefits as other authorizations for deployments from the active component. Specifically, 12304 Bravo orders does not allow National Guard soldiers to be able to utilize post-9/11 GI Bill once they return. That was not considered qualifying service for deployment. From our perspective, whether you're deployed on 12301 orders or 12304 Bravo orders, if you're doing the exact same mission overseas, you should receive the exact same benefits once you return home. In addition to that, there was about 4 or 5 other different deficiencies in this authorization that did not allow National Guard service members the opportunity and the same equal benefits that the active duty counterparts were getting for the same type of work. This is an issue that we are actively working right now on Capitol Hill. I truly think that this is something that is going to be able to get pushed through and eventually get some headway as far as making sure that we have some equal rights and equal benefits associated with these orders. Unfortunately, just like everything up on Capitol Hill, it doesn't happen overnight. And so unfortunately right now with a lot of these issues that we're finding out is that most of these soldiers and airmen don't find out they're on these orders until once they get back from their deployment. So it's not that they're being briefed before they go. Again, many of us have obviously been in uniform before. How many of us take a look at the actual authorization number that we have in our orders that says, hey, you're going over to do this mission? So that's something that we're working through right now with the states to at least allow those soldiers to know for right now expectation management that, hey, for this deployment, this is basically how you're being deployed and this is what you're entitled on this deployment. Until we can get this legislation passed through to make sure that we have the equal benefits, all we can do right now is educate and let them know here's what we're doing. And again, we've already talked on that last piece as far as the end strength. This next slide we take a look at right here, I put this up here as far as just a resource for you all if you have any questions as far as what's going on at the national level. So on our webpage, we have listed there, honestly, if you wanted to Google NGB-LL, it's the very first link to be able to pull it up. This website, we go through every piece of legislation regarding the Armed Services Committee, the Appropriations Committee for Defense, Appropriations Committee for Military Construction. We actually go ahead and take that bill, the actual text version of that bill. We go ahead and take the summary notes, and then we go ahead and do an analysis based on the Army and the Air viewpoints as far as the hot rocks, and we go ahead and put it up here on this website. This isn't just for the National Guard Bureau to be able to utilize. This is for all of you to be able to understand what is happening through our legislative process. What types of impacts are going to affect the National Guard? Not only as far as for the service members, but for the associations and everyone to understand how the legislation is working. The best thing we can do is be informed to be able to go ahead and respond to the issues that are arising. This slide right here is what we look like as far as an office. Roughly about 13 to 14 people. Currently, I am the only enlisted soldier in the office. So what does that do? Why is that important? To be truthful, I'd love to have 2 or 3 more enlisted soldiers that work with me. But I will tell you right now up on Capitol Hill, the vantage point and the importance of having a senior non-commissioned officer talking with legislators on Capitol Hill is crucial. I will tell you my viewpoint working with the officers within my specific team and office is very important. I offer a different viewpoint. Not necessarily saying that I think differently, but I believe that I speak for the soldier. That's my job as a senior non-commissioned officer. And that's the first thing that I think of when we start taking a look at legislation. How is that going to affect Private Smith? How is that going to affect Airman Smith once this rolls down? And I have to be able to offer that perspective not only to my leadership within my office, but I offer that information up when I talk with the military liaisons in the offices and our members. I will tell you that many members that we're dealing with right now want to talk with the senior enlisted. They want that perspective. They want to know how it's going to affect the larger group of people, which is their constituents. The reality is over 75% of the Army National Guard is made up of what? Enlisted. That's a very large portion. That's a lot of constituents. That's a lot of individuals that can have influence over their representative and their senator. They want that viewpoint, and they want to know how it's going to affect the National Guard. The biggest thing as we start moving forward, and this is something that I am adamantly going to work towards, and I can make a promise to you today, is that I personally am going to be working more and staying in better communication with the associations, with EANGUS. So why do you think that's important? The biggest thing that I've learned so far in about 7 months working up on Capitol Hill is messaging and communication. You have to have consistent communication, because anytime your communication or your messaging starts to differ, the information you're trying to push out there, members don't seem to care. It's like the telephone game, right? The more people that go ahead and get into that communication, the message tends to change. The intent of that message is gone. So by working with EANGUS and working with the associations, we can make sure that that strategic communication, the messaging that we want to provide to Congress, is somewhat consistent. That we can make sure that the things that are going to affect our National Guard members are actually getting taken care of. That single voice. Again, from the Title X side, I cannot lobby Congress. I cannot go up there and ask them, I need you to do this, this, and this. EANGUS can. What I can do is I can go to Congress and I can tell them the risks associated with the legislation they're looking to pass. I can let them know how it's going to affect the National Guard, but I can't go up there and say, I need you to give me this, 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 and this. That's why it's important for me to be able to communicate with the associations to say, this is the impact the Guard is looking to have with this. This is how it's going to affect our soldiers and airmen. What can we do to go ahead and try to get this corrected? And I need your help. We need to work together as a team in order to make sure that our National Guard soldiers and airmen are taken care of as we move forward. That's all I got. Thank you very much for this opportunity to come up here and talk. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. We have any questions? Yes, sir.
The rumor mill on the street is the Title V and Title 32, 20% is just the first stage. Can you elaborate on that?
All right, the question that was asked is that through the grapevine, so to speak, that the Title 32 to Title V conversion, the initial 20% was just the start of a process. I can tell you, looking at the NDAA for FY16, in essence, yes, that it specifically talks about that just being the first part of a transition. The first part being a conversion from the Title 32 technician to Title V. The second conversion taking a look at another cohort worth of technicians and seeing if they can be converted into AGR type billets. So yes, that is something that is being looked at as well. Obviously, there's a huge difference when we take a look at pulling somebody from a Title 32 status into a civilian compared to moving somebody into an active guard reservist position. Different pots of money, different command and control authorities with the individuals. Did that answer your question, sir? Anything else? Yes, sir.
Steve, throw him a mic. Throw him a mic.
Now
Got it. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for being out here this morning, our Army LL for NGB. Along the lines of that same subject, I, along with, I'm sure, quite a bit of others, are starting to get learned up a little bit more with this T-32 transfer to Title V. And it's obvious, as he emphasized earlier, our NGB leadership is hoping to, I guess, get a stay on this for at least several months to take effect in October instead of January. And I think that kind of leads not only me, but maybe others in the room to speculate, was our leadership prepared enough for when this rolled out from our Senate Armed Services Committee?
It's a tough question. So I definitely think that this is something that was somewhat being tracked prior to actual Congress passing it with the FY16 NDAA. I don't necessarily know what types of analysis were done prior to the passage of that legislation last year. Again, and not to pass the buck being on for only 7 months, and as far as understanding the impacts that happened last bill cycle to see what happened, I can't tell you exactly what type of analysis was done to see what that effects would be. I can tell you that this was something that was definitely identified as we went through the legislative cycle. But to be very truthful, I don't know if it was anticipated or don't know what kind of impact that would have on the National Guard at that point in time.
Thank you.
Absolutely. The one thing I do want to add onto this right now as we talk about that, the conversion. It's very, very important to understand as of right now, unless the FY17 National Defense Authorization is actually passed, 1 January, this will take effect. So we are actively trying to get things pushed through to make sure that the NDAA would go through prior to the initiation of January 1st to give us that little stay of execution, so to speak, before it has to take effect. But you need to understand that right now what's happening in Congress is a very unique situation, especially with the election year. When we talk about a lame duck Congress, unfortunately, that's somewhat the way that we're going right now. Everyone is dragging their feet. I do believe that you have a lot of members on the Armed Services Committees that are actively really trying to get a conference done to try to get this NDAA passed. And the NDAA is a very, very important piece of legislation for the National Guard and Department of Defense as a whole. But the thing that you need to understand with this, even though that gives us authorizations to do certain things, if we don't get any sort of appropriations to go along with it, things are going to get very, very, very difficult as we move forward. At least at this point in time, both the House and the Senate have passed their versions of the National Defense Authorization Act. When we take a look at right now what's happening on the appropriation side, the House has passed the appropriations bill on defense. The Senate can't even get it out of their own hands to start a conference. So what does that mean? What does that mean if we don't have any money? The options aren't great. Option number 1 is we go on to a continuing resolution. Option number 2 comes down to sequestration. Option number 3 is a government shutdown. Honestly, taking a look at it and talking with the offices, more than likely we're going to have a continuing resolution, at least a 3-month CR that will push us through December. I would not be surprised at all if we see a CR that goes 6 months into March. So what does that mean? So even if we pass the National Defense Authorization Act with things that are definitely going to benefit the Guard to a certain extent with a lot of these pieces of legislation, if there's no appropriations to support that, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to execute. And when we actually finally do get legislation passed as far as appropriation, we're going to have a short period of time to go ahead and try to execute the funds that are needed before we start into FY18's budget. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Senior Master Sergeant Myers from the 135th Wing, sir. Are we going to have, by January, the AFSCs or the job positions that are changing over to Title V and Title 32, just in case this happens January 1?
I can tell you that they are definitely working right now, both the Army and the Air side, as far as what tentative positions, if this would have to go ahead and take effect, what positions would be the most likely to convert initially. Again, we are again, you got to have a plan, worst case scenario of, hey, what's going to happen? This is a piece of legislation, to be very, very truthful as we move forward here. It's not one of those things I don't believe is not going to happen. And what I mean by that is that obviously we can affect a lot of things. I think there is wiggle room for us to be able to work with Congress and have a possibility of getting that initial 20% changed and perhaps have a little bit lower of a percentage as far as the initial transition. But to be honest, there's no way to sit there and say, hey, the National Guard does not like this, let's go ahead and stop. I just don't necessarily see that at this point in time happening.
Sir, as far as implementation, going along the same lines, I was more concerned with who is going to be making the decisions. Is it going to be at the base level, or is it going to be at Joint Force Headquarters? Who is going to determine what those AFSCs or those personnel in the AFSCs are going to get that conversion?
At this point in time, as far as you're looking at the transition, I believe that the decision as far as how they're going to go implement will be done by the chief and the directors as far as deciding which specific positions as far as MOSs and AFCs will actually go ahead and convert initially. I'm sure that will be pushed down through the tags and the states as far as saying, hey, this is the intent of what we're looking to do. I'm sure there's definitely going to be a lot of collaborations with the states as far as saying, hey, this is our vantage point of what we're seeing. That's going to be the least impact for the Guard as far as a transition. And so I definitely think there needs to be input from the states up through the chief and the directors in order to accomplish that. But it's going to be the chief and the directors that make that decision, say, hey, this is how we're going to go ahead and convert those.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
All right. Well, I very much appreciate you coming out. Please tell